we go. Afternoon, folks. Looks like we're working now. All right, so we're on a couple minutes early again today, like usual, but we're going to take this couple of minutes to give you a little sneak preview of what we're going to be talking about next week. So today's program is Women of Science. We're going to be talking about some of these very impressive ladies back behind me here. Next week, we're going to be talking about the first life. Some really, really neat, sometimes even ooey gooey sorts of critters. But believe it or not, a lot of them that we can still find wandering around the world today. Now, if you are in most of Wisconsin, we have a hard time finding fossils here. Up around me in particular, here in Wausau, the Colossal Fossils Museum, most of the rock that we find looks like this. This is granite, and we get a lot of granite, a lot of quartz, but this is all what we call igneous rock. It comes from lava, from deep, deep earth geologic activities. There's no fossils in this. Now, if you're in the southwestern corner of Wisconsin, sort of the bottom left corner of the state, you're in what's called the driftless zone, the driftless region. And that has some really neat stuff. Some of the fossils we'll be talking about with next week's program are actually from Wisconsin. Among those fossils, which you're getting this sneak peek of, is this right here. See if we can get, there we go. So you can see it really good on the camera. This right here and right here are two fossils in this piece of stone. Believe it or not, those are fossil jellyfish. Now, you guys know jellyfish are still around today, right? You hear about them sometimes. They float around in the ocean. Of course, they call them jellyfish because there's nothing really solid about them. They're all soft tissue. And these would be just like modern jellyfish. They've got, you can see the bell here, the little head part that kind of goes like that as they swim through the water. And here, right around that, on both of them, we can see all of the tentacles. And of course, this fossil, it's kind of neat for another reason. It actually includes the waves in the sand. If you've ever been on a sandy beach and you see where the waves are pounding on the sand and they make those ripples, these jellyfish got fossilized on the beach and they took part of the beach with them. So, there we go. So did you, was it Hunter, did you have a question real quick? Yeah.
What type of fossils at southeast corner of Wisconsin or something? Southwest corner of Wisconsin.
Okay, so if you're in that driftless zone, depending on where you are, you can find fossils like this, things like clams, ammonites, mostly undersea creatures, because at the time there were animals living there making fossils. It was deep under the ocean, under what we call the Great Inland Sea. Now, for everybody here, looks like we're at our 1 o'clock. We're ready to get started. So for those of you who just joined in, we're giving the early comers a little sneak preview of next week's program, The First Life. So for any first timers, I'm Sean, Cave Sean, or even the Mammoth Hunter, here at the Colossal Fossils Museum in Wausau. What I do for the museum is called experimental archaeology. I take artifacts from our past, from people of the past, and I build replicas or copies of them. and then I take them out and I use them. I test them in the real world to learn more about what our ancestors did. Now, for several of our programs, we go much, much farther back in time than that has much to do with. But today, our program is Women of Science. We're going to be talking about the whole table full of very impressive scientists behind me and the contributions that they've made to our modern understanding of paleontology, archaeology, evolution, and even whole new branches of science. Now, if we think of a scientist, especially it's Halloween season, right? We think of a mad scientist, usually think of a little fellow in a lab coat, doing his sciencey thing, or occasionally maybe somebody thinks of like an Indiana Jones type of person. But believe it or not, a lot of our modern science, actually a good chunk of what I do for the museum, has very, very important contributions from many of the women that we're going to talk about today. Now, the first on our list is Mary Ann Mantell. Now, for Mary Ann, we actually have to go back in time quite a ways. She was born in 1790. So far back, in fact, that we don't even have a photo. We got a painting. Now, Mary Ann made a very important discovery. Without her, actually, there's a possibility that the museum wouldn't even exist. So in 1822, she was on a carriage ride with her husband. Her husband was, I remember he was a doctor. He was going out to check on one of his patients. And well, the carriage was parked and she was waiting. She took a walk, and along a roadside where some workmen had been digging things up and repairing the road, just like today, except more shovels, less bulldozers, she found a really neat rock. And this rock contained a dinosaur tooth. Now, at this time, dinosaurs and prehistoric life were actually very, very poorly understood. Prior to the late 1700s, early 1800s, in fact, if you found, say, a woolly mammoth skull, you wouldn't think that it was a prehistoric extinct elephant. Nobody really understood extinction or prehistoric life. Instead, you end up with these sort of fantasy creatures like elephant skulls, or rather mammoth and mastodon skulls, used to be thought of as cyclops. Dinosaur jaws, or even marine reptile jaws with these big teeth, were dragons. But Mary Ann, she found this tooth, kind of a leaf-shaped tooth in the rock, and thought it was really interesting. She took her time, did very detailed sketches and descriptions, and studied this fossil, and eventually consulted with a scientist of the time. I'm going to try and get his name right. My French is terrible. Georges Cuvier. And he got so excited about this that, excuse me, he actually took an excavation team and dug up the entire site where she found this tooth. And what it turned out is that Mary Ann Mantell had discovered the first fossil of an iguanodon. Now, iguanodon is important for a couple of reasons. First off, it is the first dinosaur described as a reptilian animal. They actually found a full skeleton over by where she found this tooth. And iguanodon is an early ancestor of like the duck-billed dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs. You'd recognize some of them from like the Jurassic Park movies. They're grazing animals. Iguanodons were kind of interesting. They had, where your thumb would be on their front feet while they walked, they had a long spike. So they're always given a thumbs up everywhere they go. But Iguanodon was actually one of the very first dinosaurs discovered and recognized as a distinct group, as a dinosaur, as opposed to, say, an ancient mammal or something like that. Right about the same time, Megalodon was discovered. And sorry, megalodon, megalosaur. Megalodon's a big fish. Megalosaurus, the big dinosaur. And they only got a few bones, jaws, teeth, and if you look at Crystal Gardens reconstructions from the early 1800s, they made these things look like gigantic, clunky lizards. They got a few things wrong. A lot of guesswork back then. But her discovery led to the dawn of paleontology as a science, this study of extinct creatures. Now, right next to her here, we have Miss Mary Anning. Now, Mary Anning lived a little bit later. You can see still too early for photographs. We've got her painted here. Actually, she's got her little dog there. And Mary Anning made several discoveries that are still kind of important today. Where was I? Oh, so Mary Anning lived in Dorset, England, and Dorset has a coastline and ocean that it's eroding away bank, what we call mudstone, constantly, and so there's always new fossils out there. And she would walk up and down the beach and go collect these fossils. And actually, she eventually became a fossil dealer. She started selling them. She was finding mainly things like this. Now this here is an ammonite. Believe it or not, we can find these types of these in Wisconsin, in the driftless region in the southwestern corner of the state. Unless it's changed, if I remember right, the ammonite is actually the Wisconsin state fossil. Some of these could get to be 6 feet across. They could be really huge. Now in life, he would have had his head and tentacles sticking out of his open shell here. And it'd be a lot like a squid. It'd swim backwards. If something tried to eat them, they could pull in, and they actually had a little hard shell door that would cover the opening of the shell. So they would be really, really solid, really hard to get to. And now, along with collecting and actually selling these fossils, Mary Anning really got into paleontology. She started doing descriptions, sketches, keeping really close tabs on what she was finding. Now, eventually she got to be known globally as a really talented fossil hunter. And she made friends with Elizabeth Philpott, who I unfortunately don't have a picture of, but I can show you actually some of her work. She did some really detailed sketches and drawings of the fossils that they found. And she found with some fossils like this is a Cylindra toothus, but a relative of this called a belemnite. As Philpott discovered that these actually have ink chambers in them. So if you open this up, there'd be a little pocket in there where when this was a live animal, a squid swimming around the ocean like this, it held the ink. Now, like modern day squids, octopus, things like that, if say a shark swims up and tries to munch on them, they can spit out a cloud of ink and use it as, sort of like the Batman smoke bomb, so they can get away, right? It confuses the shark. It actually has chemicals in it that affect a shark or a fish's sense of smell. So it makes it harder for it to find the squid or the octopus. Well, these ancient cephalopods could do that same thing. What Elizabeth Philpott discovered is that if she broke that open and added some water and mixed it up real good, she could use the ink from hundreds of millions of years old fossilized squid to do her drawings and sketches of the fossils they found. Prior to that, no one had actually thought to do that or even knew that the fossils had ink pouches, ink cases inside of them. for a while after that discovery. It actually became a very popular thing to use fossilized ink. Then during that period of time, people were and had been using octopus and squid ink as writing ink for a long time. Now these two, they became good friends. They spent a lot of time actually wandering around collecting fossils. Elizabeth Philpott had two sisters, and they got into the fossil collecting too, but not quite as much as she did. Now, Mary Anning and Elizabeth Philpott are responsible for some really neat early fossil discoveries. They actually discovered the first pterosaur, first like pterodactyl, outside of Germany. At this time, we only knew flying reptiles from one or two places in Germany. Now, of course, we know they show up all over the world, from the size of a pigeon all the way up to the size of a giraffe or a small airplane. But mainly, they were known for marine fossils. They discovered the first plesiosaurs. The plesiosaurs are like the long-necked, small head, really toothy jaws, flippers. Prior to their fossil digging and fossil collecting efforts, that was unknown. And what I've got here, this big fella, they discovered and described the first ichthyosaurs. Now, ichthyosaurs are really neat animals. They were very successful. They lasted for quite a long time, about 100 million years, in fact. Some of them got to be the size of whales, more than 60 feet long. A lot of them were this size, about the size of dolphins. But this guy, it's not a fish. It is a lizard's version of a dolphin. So I'm going to bring this fella close to the camera so I can show you this detail. He doesn't have feet. He has flippers. But if you look at that flipper real closely, you can see the rows of bones. Those are toe bones or finger bones. And what happened, the ichthyosaurs spent so much time in water that their hands, their feet, fused together into flippers like dolphin fins. The same on his back feet. Now, if we look at the face here, at the head, you can see ichthyosaurs had very large eyes. This is his eye right here, would have been about that big. In fact, they had some of the largest eyes proportionally of any vertebrate. And this jaw here got real long and narrow. It's a lot like a dolphin's nose, so like a bottlenose dolphin, but it's full of tiny, sharp little teeth. They kind of almost look like crocodile teeth. And they all interlock when it bites down, which makes it really good at catching slippery animals like squid or fish. Now, ichthyosaurs were air breathers, just like modern reptiles, just like dolphins today, but they were so specialized, so well adapted for the water, they couldn't come out onto land anymore. In fact, it's really hard to see on this fossil, but the tailbone bends down like this at the end, and then there was a cartilage piece on the top, which gave it a tail that looked just like a shark's tail. And they swam by moving their tail back and forth just like a fish or a shark. But because they were so specialized, they couldn't get out of the water, they evolved to give live birth. They quit laying eggs. We've actually found a fossil that has an ichthyosaur in the process of giving birth to another ichthyosaur. Set that down without it falling over. There we go. It's heavy and fragile. It's a dangerous combination. So Mary Anning and Elizabeth Philpott, they both got pretty well known for their collecting and in geological circles and scientific circles around the world at the time. And I will warn you, if you do go out fossil hunting and searching around, especially on slick rock and mudstone shores along the ocean, you got to be careful. In the 1820s, Mary Anning actually almost died in a landslide. So you got to watch out for that if you're climbing up on cliff faces and slick rock to collect your fossils. Now, along with all of these discoveries that we've talked about so far, they found bunches and bunches of new shelled animals, ammonite cephalopods, like I said, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, pterosaurs. They basically cataloged and dug up and discovered an entire ecosystem's worth of beach along where they were helping out. And actually their discoveries and their descriptions of their fossils helped us to prove that extinction was a real phenomenon. See, at this time in the early 1800s, like I said, people didn't understand that that animals that had existed previously died off and don't exist anymore, like dinosaurs, for example. You know, today we understand the process and we know it fully, but it was their discoveries that helped us really figure that out. Particularly because of the large marine reptiles, things like the plesiosaurs and pterosaurs that they were finding, because they're so different from any modern animal, but they lived in that same area. Now, Elizabeth Philpott here, along with her collecting and her discoveries or spending time with Mary Anning, she got to be a very well-known and really sought after researcher, geologist, artist. She actually consulted with paleontologists, early paleontologists and scientists of the time, like William Buckland or William Conybeare. Her artwork can actually still be found in some museums today. She was really, really good. And she did most of her artwork with that sort of revitalized extinct squid ink that we talked about. Now, our next woman of science here that we're going to talk about is a lady from a little bit more recently in time. She was born in the late 1800s, lived right up to the 1950s. This is a photograph of Dorothea Bait. Now, Dorothea Bait made some really, really neat discoveries. So, excuse me, fall allergies here. At the age of 19, she got a job at the Natural History Museum in London. And her first job, believe it or not, was actually sorting bird skins. So back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, scientists did some things that we would think are a little funny and a little odd today. Among those, they would take skins and preserve the skins as specimens for the museum, kind of like the skeletons. Well, when a place like the Museum of London has people all over the place, they end up with a lot of these. So she literally had a job sorting out and organizing bird skins. Would you like that for your first job, huh? Well, she ended up working at the museum for more than 50 years, not just in bird skins, but she did work in ornithology, in paleontology, in geology, in anatomy. She ended up traveling to several places all over the world. And in one of those places, she made a really fascinating discovery, something that we really hadn't seen before. She discovered a species of dwarf elephant. So elephants are huge, right? Well, a dwarf elephant, it's really small for an elephant. It's still kind of a big animal, about the size of a cow. I'm going to grab this here. So this little setup here, this is an elephant, a dwarf elephant tooth. This particular one's from a dwarf mammoth. Just for comparison, this is a full-sized mammoth tooth. And you can see it's about twice the size of that dwarf elephant tooth. If we look at the top of the tooth, you can see The textures are the same. They're eating the same stuff. The build, the makeup of the tooth, the way it grows is pretty much the same. This one's just smaller. Now what she stumbled across there, what she discovered was the first evidence of an entirely new phenomena, something that we didn't understand at the time, called insular dwarfism. So insular dwarfism is something that's happened to a lot of animals over time. Some of them you'd actually probably recognize. One of them was actually even one of our ancestors. If you remember from last week, the early hominids, Homo erectus. Some Homo erectus ended up on a small island in the South Pacific, and they ended up with this phenomena having a very solid effect on them. They went from about 6 feet tall over several generations to about 3 feet tall. We call them the Hobbit people because Lord of the Rings was very popular when the first fossils were discovered. But, you know, they're our ancestors. They're not elephants. Now, today you can find on the Florida Keys, you can find key deer, which unlike our big Wisconsin whitetails, key deer are specially adapted to their island. They're about the size of a dog. They're kind of cute, actually. Now, Dorothea, she didn't just discover this dwarf elephant. She actually ended up on the island of Crete doing some paleontology work and digging around. And some archaeologists there pointed her in the right direction. She discovered something called the Cretian dwarf hippo, which again, like the elephant, it's another big animal that's shrunk down. And with some study and some more poking around and digging around, Dorothea discovered this process. She figured out how it works. And what happens with insular dwarfism is an animal, especially a large animal like an elephant or a hippo or even a dinosaur, gets isolated. It gets sort of stuck on this island in this small habitat, and a habitat that's not big enough for the size of the animal. And over time, over a few generations, because the resources, especially food and space on these islands, or sometimes even very isolated cut-off valleys, are so limited, the maximum adult size of the animal is limited. It tops out. And eventually you end up with elephants the size of cows, or deers the size of dogs, or even people that are only 3 feet tall. Now, Dorothea, she made several other discoveries in her long career. Among them was even something called the mouse goat. Now, over her career, 50 years working in the museum, one of her areas of specialty was anatomy. She was actually very, very good at it. So good, in fact, that many contemporary paleontologists and archaeologists would consult with her if they had a fossil that they just couldn't figure out. So a lot of times when we find fossils, I don't want to say they're disarticulated, they're jumbled, or they're incomplete. And Dorothea here was, she was really good at figuring out that puzzle. Now, some of the people that she consulted for, remember last week, we talked about Lucy and Australopithecus. The folks who discovered Lucy are Lewis and Mary Leakey, Charles McBurney, and John Desmond Clark. And well, they found a lot of early hominids, a lot of human bones and stuff out there. And Dorothea Bait actually came down and helped them kind of put the puzzle together and figure out what these different pieces were and how they all worked together, and sometimes where they even fit in relation to us in the family tree. Now, next, we're going to meet Miss Tilly Edinger. Now Tilly, you know, have a photo here. She was actually born in Germany and was very highly educated. She spent a lot of time in school, did a lot of homework. Between 1938 and 1940, just before World War II, she actually came to New York. Now she studied zoology, she studied paleontology, she studied geology, but most impressively of all, she developed an entirely new form of science. She did something that no one had ever done before, no one had ever thought before. In 1929, she wrote the founding work on what we call Paleoneurology. And some of her earlier work was on early hominids, things like Nutcracker Man here. We're gonna get back to this fellow in a minute. But what she did, particularly with those early studies and those early efforts, she would make a mold of the hollow space inside of the skull to get a model of the brain. And so she was the first person who realized that we could actually study the brains of prehistoric hominids or prehistoric animals. So paleoneurology is the study of ancient brains, really. Now, because of this study, we were able to find out rather some really neat stuff. So at this time, it was thought, and you might have kind of heard sort of remnants of this sort of argument before that, you know, a big brain means you're smart, right? Well, at this time, it was thought that the bigger the brain relative to your body size, the more intelligent you are. Like that was considered scientific fact. Well, through her early studies in paleoneurology, what she discovered is that evolution doesn't really pay attention to that. A lot of times an animal, initially she was studying ancient horses, will get a bigger body and then the brain will kind of catch up afterward. She started out with things like what we call Eohippus. It's a little tiny ancestor of a horse. It lived in the woods and it kind of looked like a donkey, but really, really small. And eventually they moved out onto the plains as the environment changed and they developed into the horses that we would recognize today. Well, what she found is that over time they got bigger as animals before their brains got bigger, but they didn't seem to be getting dumber as they got bigger. They kept doing what they were doing. And so she followed up this study with other animals, other group types, and she found very consistently that we evolved to get bigger before our brains do. So what she was able to prove is actually that your brain to body size ratio, though it can be used as kind of a marker, it's not a really accurate measure of intelligence. Now, paleoneurology also allows us to do some really, really neat things. So we have a lot of animals today, a lot of things that you see every day, some things, of course, that are very rare. But the important thing about an animal that's alive today is we can X-ray its brain, and then we can compare that X-ray to things it does. Sense of smell, sense of sight, sense of hearing, behaviors, right? We can observe, say, a living crocodile and get an idea of how that brain works for that animal. Well, what paleoneurology allows us to do is take an animal that's not alive today, like the original owner of this skull. Now this one's a model, of course, but the full-size skull. We can make a cast, take an X-ray, do an MRI, and 3D print the brain of, say, a T-Rex. And then we can compare that brain, that sort of hardware, that equipment, to modern animals. And we can find equivalent adaptations, equivalent areas of the brain that are developed. And though it's not 100%, we can use that to infer, say, how powerful a Tyrannosaurus Rex's sense of smell was, or how good its eyesight was, by comparing its brain to crocodiles, birds, mammals, things today. And because of that, we actually think now, not only can T-Rex see you if you hold still, but it can probably see you from more than a mile away. The area of its brain that's devoted to its sense of smell was massive. What that tells us is not only did it use its sense of smell to really identify its world and kind of find its way around, we think a T-Rex could probably smell you from 10 to 12 miles away. The equivalent today is actually a turkey vulture, which can smell old meat from about 10 miles away, a few thousand feet up in the air. So, thanks to Tilly, we have a better idea of what's going on in the brains of prehistoric animals, and almost as more importantly, in my mind, how those animals behaved because of some of those developments, the brains. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned Lucy and our early hominid ancestors. Tilly did a lot of research, a lot of work on them, and studied their brains. So she helped us with paleoneurology to figure out how we got from, chimpanzee to us. Well, our next scientist here is Mary Leakey. Now, Mary Leakey got started actually going along with her husband on digs, Louis Leakey. Unfortunately, Mr. Leakey died, I believe, of illness. I don't want to say for sure. I remember reading about it back in the 70s, something like 1972. Well, Mary, she'd done a lot of work. They discovered a lot of things together, and she continued that work for decades after. Mary Leakey discovered some amazing things. She actually lived up to the age of 93, well, into the middle 90s, 1996. So over her career, she discovered 15 brand new species, completely unknown to science. One of those species is actually really important. If you remember last week when we talked about how we're kind of related to chimpanzees, but the tree branched off, somewhere back there was that point where chimpanzees and hominids were in the same family, same kind of animal. Mary Leakey discovered that ape. It's called proconsul, and she actually found the skull of it. Now, proconsul is important because not only is it the sort of the missing link, the common ancestor between ancient apes and hominids, but at the time it was discovered, it was a completely new group of primates. Proconsul apes don't exist anymore. And though they're related to things like chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, and even us, they're distinctly different. Believe it or not, they evolved in Europe and moved down to Africa, and in Africa evolved into the species that we recognize from last week. Now, excuse me, I'm gonna grab another sip. Leaf mold is killing me this year. Sorry about that. So among her discoveries, of course, Mary Leakey was directly involved with the discovery of Lucy, which we talked about quite a bit last week. But Mary discovered this guy. We talked a little bit about this guy last week. When it was first discovered, I'm going to try to pronounce this, it's kind of a funny name. They named it Zinjanthropus. So Zinjanthropus is the original discovery name for it. We don't use that anymore. This is Paranthropus boisei, and it's gone through a couple of different names over the years, but Paranthropus boisei is the current species recognition for this. Now, this was a hominid. And where Mary Leakey was doing most of her digging in Tanzania and the Olduvai region of Africa, they were finding a lot of hominids. Now, at the time that Paranthropus and Lucy, Australopithecus, were walking around, of course, there's no humans yet. It's about 3.5 million years ago, but there are several different groups of hominids, of human-like ancestors, Paranthropus being one of them. They nicknamed him Nutcracker Man. Now, we do not think that Nutcracker Man is a direct ancestor of us, mainly because of this right here. That's what we call a sagittal crest, and that's muscle attachment. What that tells us is that this fella had a really strong bite. We think he was eating a lot of really crunchy, tough stuff, maybe like grasses, seeds, and of course, nuts. He's got really big teeth, more than twice as big as our teeth, our molars. Now, yet another awesome discovery made by Miss Leakey. Was the Litolai Trackway. Now this is just a small section. These are footprints, we think, from an Australopithecus, like Lucy, one of our direct ancestors. Now, this is a long trackway made by early hominids, and it was actually made in volcanic ash. The volcano had erupted and the ash was falling out of the sky, and it got mixed with probably rainwater. And it basically makes it into sort of a natural concrete. And so when our distant Australopithecus ancestors walked through this, they left their footprints, but it hardened into stone when it dried. And so it lasted more than 3 million years until they found it. A couple of neat things. If we look at the footprints themselves, we can see their feet were just like ours. The big toe here, the arch on the inside of the foot, the heel impression where they put their weight down. Of course, 4 little toes here. Now their feet are smaller because they're smaller. Their footprint of the adult here is about half as big as my footprint. But this tells us that adults and young were living together just like we do today. See, these footprints that are smaller are from a little kid. So this was a young Australopithecus and an adult taking a walk through a volcanic ash field. Now, early hominid footprints like this are very rare, and to find a big trackway is quite a discovery. Now, and not last and not least, among all of the other things that Mary Leakey did in her long career, you remember some of our stone tools from last week. Well, in the Olduvai Gorge, in this region of Africa, they find lots and lots and lots of these stone tools. It seems like our early hominid ancestors made a lot of these and used them, and then, you know, well, don't want to carry it, so they just leave it. Well, Mary actually developed an entirely new system for organizing and classifying these so that scientists, experimental archaeology types like myself, can more easily figure out not only the progression of which one was made first and what technique led to what, but we can go through and make reproductions to test them out and try to figure out how these early hominids were using them. You know, say like a steak knife as opposed to an axe. Now, we're finally getting a little bit closer to our time period. We're going to actually start talking about some scientists that are still doing work today. So next on our list is Miss Angela Milner. This is Angela, Nice first real color photograph, right? And she's actually there working in her lab at the British Museum of Natural History. She's a paleontologist there, and she has made some really awesome discoveries. Now, first off, she was co-discoverer of a dinosaur called Baryonyx. And if you saw the last Jurassic World movie, they had a Baryonyx in there, kind of, but Jurassic Park got it totally wrong. Baryonyx is a fascinating animal. It looks awesome. I wish they had done it right. So this little picture to give you an idea of Baryonyx. Baryonyx has a long crocodile-like snout. It's actually got a notch and a corresponding kind of bump on its lower jaw that works like a trap. It's got long, very powerful arms, three-fingered claws, and on its thumbs, it has almost velociraptor-like big hooked claws. And this is an animal that's about 25 feet long. It's almost as long as a school bus. Now, what's important about Baryonyx is that at the time that this dinosaur was discovered, we didn't think that dinosaurs went into the water or ate fish. Well, the Baryonyx fossil that she helped discover had fish scales inside the rib cage where the stomach would be. And they showed signs of acid etching, which tells us that this Baryonyx didn't die, turn into a skeleton, and then a fish hid inside of it and died and fossilized. It actually ate that fish. So it is the first, what we call piscivore, or fish-eating dinosaur that we knew of. Now today, we know there's something like a dozen different species that are all related to Baryonyx from Africa, South America, and Europe. One of them you probably would recognize from the movies, the Spinosaurus. Just to show you here, this is a Spinosaurus tooth. This is a fossil from Morocco in Africa. And this is a fairly small one actually, but like a modern crocodile tooth, it's cone-shaped, round. It's really just a spike. It's got a little bit of serration in it, but it's not much of a steak knife. These dinosaurs were using their jaws as fish traps. Now, a neat little detail though, Baryonyx has also been discovered with Iguanodon bones in its gullet. So we think it was kind of an opportunistic predator, and it would eat, well, any meat that it could get, not just fish. Now, recent discoveries with Spinosaurus show us that this family of dinosaurs was actually semi-aquatic, to the point that Spinosaurus, we think now, had webbed feet, and it had a big, wide, flat tail. So it was definitely spending a lot of time in the water. Baryonyx was a little bit better adapted to time on the shore. We can probably think of it as being a lot like a great blue heron with a crocodile mouth instead of a long pointy beak. Now, Baryonyx isn't the only thing that, that she got into. Now, we talked about that Paleonurology a little bit. Angela Milner did some work on this fellow. Now, this is Archaeopteryx. Some of you dinosaur fans out there might recognize this fossil. Archaeopteryx lithographica is a really famous fossil. This is the missing link between dinosaurs and birds. We take a close look at it here. You can see it's got gripping feet, just like a sparrow, like a parakeet. You can see on the wings, the tail here, and even some spots in the body, you can tell it was covered in feathers. They show it pretty good in the lighting. It has big eyes and light hollow bones, just like a bird. But if we take a closer look, in the mouth, you can see teeth. On the wings, it has clawed hands, very much like a velociraptor's hands. And it's got a long bony tail. If you removed the feathers from this, it would look like one of the Jurassic Park compies. And it's actually closely related to that group. Now, there was a debate for a long time. This is what we call a transitional species. It has mosaic anatomy, which means kind of a mix and match of different features from different groups. This is a 50-50 cross between a bird and a dinosaur. Well, thanks to paleoneurology and some research by Angela Milner, she studied the brain, the hardware, the build of the head and the, what do I want to say, the areas of development in the brain. And so we now classify Archaeopteryx as the first true bird, even though it's still very closely related to dinosaurs. Now, this fossil has taught us another neat thing about Archaeopteryx, but we're going to come back to it in just a moment here, because we've got another scientist to talk about, and it's heavy. Now, Archaeopteryx is, of course, a fascinating fossil, but who here likes T-Rex? Yeah? So, this is Sue Hendrickson. And you can see there in the photograph, she's actually digging up a T-Rex fossil. If you look really closely, get the camera to focus, there you go. You can see the teeth right here. Now, Sue has had an adventurous life. She's done some really cool stuff. She actually, at one point, worked on shipping salvage, where she'd go dive down to shipwrecks and find stuff, even things like pirate ships sometimes. For a while, she worked in a place called the Dominican Republic, and she was a dealer, a seller of amber. She actually became a huge supplier of amber for scientific study. Now, amber, if you remember your Jurassic Park, is where they got the dinosaur DNA to do the clones, you know, to make the dinosaurs. Now, I want to clear that up. DNA breaks down after 40 to 50,000 years, so it gets really crumbly, really, well, it won't work to make a dinosaur clone. And drilling a hole through amber into a mosquito will not only not get you dinosaur DNA, it will contaminate your samples. So Jurassic Park, unfortunately, it was a neat idea, but it wouldn't work. But Sue found lots and lots of neat amber fossils, among them 3 perfectly preserved butterflies, just encased in fossilized tree sap. They were about 23 million years old, so not quite dinosaur age, but still, it's a really neat fossil. Now, most famously of all, Sue spent some time doing fossil hunting and digging all around the world. She spent some time in Peru, finding fossils of seals and dolphins and sharks, things like that. But on August 12th of 1990, she stumbled across the largest, most complete, and best preserved Tyrannosaurus Rex ever found. And that Tyrannosaurus Rex was actually named Sue in her honor. Now, Tyrannosaurus Sue was so well preserved and so complete, it gave us parts of T-Rex that we've never seen before, things like an almost complete arm. It showed signs of disease, age, injury, damage to the jaw, we think from a fungal infection, arthritis and healed broken bones in the legs. So T-Rex Sue, at 8 tons and 42 feet long, was a sore, tired, ornery old T-Rex, but a massive animal and a huge, important fossil discovery. Now, if you want to see that T-Rex today, it's still in the Chicago Field Museum, which not all that far from right here in Wisconsin. It used to be a mount right inside the front door. So as soon as you go into the museum, you get in there, there's that Tyrannosaurus Rex, larger than life. Now, I was recently informed that they've moved that exhibit up to the second floor with the rest of the dinosaurs, and they've got a large sauropod in there, so an even bigger plant-eating dinosaur. But Sue is still on display in the Field Museum. Really, if you go look at her face to face, even as a fossil, she's an intimidating animal. Now, up next, we've got Mary Schweitzer here. Now, Mary is a paleontologist for the North Carolina State University. And she does some really, really neat research. She was the first person, led the group that discovered soft tissue preserved in dinosaur fossils. Now, this isn't quite like pieces of meat or bone marrow inside the fossil bones, nothing quite so crazy as that, but she found the first remains of cartilage, of connective tissue, of blood proteins inside of a T-Rex. Now, that's why we've got a T-Rex tooth here from Ms. Schweitzer. Now, what's important about that is that, like with that paleoneurology science, the brain science, we can compare those proteins, those cells, the structure of them and their makeup to modern animals. And we can use those details to learn a lot about extinct animals. And remember, I said there was one more neat detail about our Archaeopteryx here. It's that very science, that type of discovery, that allows us to tell what color some prehistoric animals were. So for example, Archaeopteryx was about the size of a pigeon, and it was black like a crow, except a little bit of purple iridescence around its head. So it wasn't quite a dinosaur peacock, but it looked a lot like a modern bird. Now, the Ichthyosaur that we talked about way back at the beginning, well, Ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs, from protein remnants, soft tissue remnants in the scales and the skin impressions, we know that they were colored a lot like orcas, killer whales, or great white sharks. Dark gray or black along the back and down the sides, and then the light, almost white on the bellies. And that's something called countershading. And it works as camouflage for these marine reptiles and for sharks and killer whales today. It makes them much harder for their prey to see while they try to sneak up on them. Now, thanks to her cutting edge work on soft tissue remnants, we call organelle structures, and the ability to do comparisons with these tissues, these cells, these little bits and pieces with modern animals, we actually have our best chance of making a dinosaur. Not by cloning it from blood taken out of amber, but by using modern genetic manipulation tools to take something like, say, a chicken, and sort of tweak its DNA code to match what we find in the fossil soft tissue remnants. So we wouldn't exactly have, say, a velociraptor, but we might get a really neat looking dino chicken. And who knows what the future might bring. Now, last but not least, I have Miss Gerda Keller. Gerda is a paleontologist, still doing a lot of fascinating work today. Her area of study is what we call the KT boundary. It's the line that marks the extinction of the dinosaurs. You look at this really neat thing here. Get my lighting right, there we go. This probably just looks like a vial of dirt because it is just a vial of dirt. But It's really, really neat dirt. So there we go. Down here is Mesozoic soil, is Cretaceous soil. We find T-Rex, Triceratops, you know, all kinds of dinosaurs. Up here is after that. It's all mammals, no dinosaurs. In between, that is the impact layer. Gerda has been studying this layer, and what she's determined from her studies is that even though the asteroid that ended the Cretaceous, ended the dinosaurs, was probably a huge contributing factor, it's actually things like environmental change and volcanoes that were contributors that kind of set them up for extinction, for the asteroid to just finish them off, instead of previous theories where it was just a big space rock. I'll just show you something neat here. So this is a little model of our Empire State Building. This is an asteroid that's flying around up in space right now, right here in our solar system. Now, this particular asteroid, it has a name and number distinction, and I've forgotten it. It's, you know, something like MT-173. But the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs was about 6 miles across. So it would be about, oh, yay big compared to our little building here. And it slammed into the earth going more than 20 times the speed of a bullet. Made a crater about 200 miles across. That's like here from the Wausau Museum all the way down to Sioux in Chicago. And thanks to her work, thanks to her discoveries, we have a better understanding of exactly how the mechanics of that worked, how it happened, and she's still working on that today. Now, that's everybody I have back here to introduce you today. I want to make sure we get a couple of minutes for questions. I saw a hand raised at one point there. If you have any questions or you want a closer look at any of the fossils and or bits that I had to share today, go ahead and chime in. Let me know, and I'll be happy to show you more. Oh, did you have a question? You can. I can't hear you. You gotta unmute your mic. Oh. Yep. Was it on Victoria? Go ahead.
What is the dwarf elephant?
Okay, so the dwarf elephant is really, it's just like a big full-sized elephant, except over several generations, because they were stuck on an island, they just got smaller. So it actually looks just like a regular normal elephant, except instead of being this huge, huge animal, it's not much bigger than a cow. It's kind of small. So if you saw a picture of it just by itself, it would just look like an elephant. But if you saw a picture of one next to a regular African or Asian elephant, then you'd really be able to tell the difference right away.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Are there any other questions from anybody? I see a raised hand. Was that Hunter? Yeah, go ahead.
What is a what is that? When are we going to talk about that skull? That dinosaur skull. No, not that one. That one. That one over there.
This one over here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, we actually talked about this one with the Tyrannosaurus Rex show a couple of weeks ago. This is just a tiny little model of it so that I can show you where the brain goes. But as we talk about sky monsters and sea monsters in future programs, we'll come back to T-Rex a little bit because T-Rex was walking around while some of the creatures we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks were swimming or flying. They kind of shared an ancient world together. All right, I think we got time for one or two more questions. Does anybody else have any questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Not seeing anybody else. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I hope you you all enjoyed the show today. I hope you learned something, maybe even took some inspiration from these amazing women of science. Like I said, for the early comers, next week's program is going to be The First Life. We're going to look at some really awesome ancient fossils like this one here, some of which we can find in certain places here in Wisconsin. Thank you all for joining us here at Colossal Fossils, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.